Before we get into the stories, I just wanted to quickly mention, as the title suggests, the following experiences really are true stories based on my very own girlfriend's personal life. I have of course slightly altered a few small details for entertainment purposes, but rest assured each story is genuinely something that she has experienced in her life. So with that in mind, let's get into the first story. So, I was on my way home from a long day at work, taking the underground train as usual. At the time, I had my headphones on, trying to drown out the sounds of the bustling train. I remember I was just staring at my phone when I suddenly noticed from the corner of my eye, a man on the opposite side of the train was staring at me. I looked up and caught eyes with him, but he quickly looked away. I was a little uncomfortable, but I tried to just shrug it off as one of those instances where you accidentally lock eyes with someone, and it's awkward for a short while until you just kind of move on. Anyway, I turned my attention back to my phone, hoping to relax and unwind after my busy day. But a few seconds later, I caught that same man staring at me again. I didn't look right at him this time, as I was honestly quite afraid. In that moment, I just wanted the earth to swallow me up and transport me to my bed. But for the rest of the journey, it was as if the man was fixated on me. In the end, I decided to get off at the next stop and quickly power walked further up the platform and jumped back on the train before the doors were about to close. I sat back down and breathed a sigh of relief as I had managed to move 4 carriages down, and there was no way he would have seen me get back on the train. Well, the rest of the journey was nothing special. I sat near another woman, which made me feel a little more at ease, and I was finally able to relax again, just as we neared the train's final stop. As the train approached the platform, I gathered my things and made my way to the doors. But as I stepped off the train, I was met with a horrifying sight. That same man from earlier was walking down the platform in my direction, and he was staring right at me. I started walking faster, hoping to lose him in the crowd, but every time I looked back, I could see that he was keeping up with me. As I neared the barriers, I could feel his presence getting closer and closer, and I felt the panic start to rise within my body. I quickly tapped my travel card and burst through the barriers, hoping to rush out of the station before he saw which direction I would be walking home. As I reached the escalator, I stepped onto the moving stairs, but there was a little old lady standing with her bag blocking the way. Looking back, I'm so angry with myself for not speaking up at the time, but I felt bad asking her to move out of the way. So despite my fear of this man potentially catching up with me, I decided to stay put, hoping he wouldn't see me. Well, as you can imagine, this was a terrible decision, as about halfway up the escalator, I suddenly felt a pair of hands wrap around my waist. I wanted to turn around and confront the person, but I was genuinely frozen to the spot. I was so shocked. It was like my brain had shut off and I was unable to move. My body was tense and I remember struggling to breathe. Well, after what felt like an eternity, I regained some clarity and turned around to face the person who was behind me. And what I saw still sticks in my mind to this day. It was the man from the train, of course, but this time he had the creepiest smile on his face. And I don't know if this is just the way I remember it or if I am just exaggerating, but I swear his eyes were pitch black. And that's when he opened his mouth. "Hello there, beautiful." At first, I was still shell-shocked, but eventually I was able to give him a stern look, and he immediately apologized. He claimed that he had simply mistaken me for someone else, and then quickly ran down the escalator, pushing past the people below. I just stood there, trying to catch my breath, wondering what the hell just happened. a woman who was standing below me on the escalator asked me if I knew that man and if I was okay. I told her he was just some weirdo from the train and I had no idea who he was. She apologized to me, because apparently the man had asked her if he could stand behind me, as he wanted to surprise his girlfriend. I was horrified. This man knew exactly what he was doing, and who knows what would have happened if there was nobody else on the escalator that day. Not gonna lie, I still have nightmares from time to time about this experience. I know technically nothing that bad ended up happening, but the fear I felt in that moment is truly something I had never experienced before. I've considered seeking therapy to help me through my trauma, but I feel like there are women out there that have experienced much worse, and sometimes I feel like I'm overreacting. But nevertheless, this experience did teach me one thing, which is that if you're ever on your own and somebody is making you feel uncomfortable, please just tell someone, as you never know what that creep on the train could be capable of. Before I get into the next story, I just wanted to say that this one was written by my girlfriend herself. So, I've always considered myself as a brave girl. As long as I'm aware of my surroundings and avoid walking down any dark alleyways at night, I know I'll be safe. It wasn't until that night where I encountered a weird man on my way home. After meeting up with my friends for a drink, I started walking back home as usual, as I was not going to waste my money on an Uber when I could just walk back home within half an hour. The first 15 minutes wasn't that bad, apart from my feet feeling really sore after wearing heels all night. As I was deep in my thoughts of thinking how dumb I was to not bring a pair of trainers to swap out, I noticed a man walking down the road towards my direction. I politely moved to the right side of the road so that I was not walking into him or getting in his way. However, as I shifted to the side, he started slowly moving towards the same side of the road. I proceeded to walk further to the right, so I was now right up against the brick wall, but strangely, he did the same, and he was now right in front of me, face to face. I stopped and looked at him, as he stared at me while putting his arm out. For a second, I didn't know how to react. As his arm was about to touch my shoulder, I instantly backed off and ran past him. I looked back and I saw him standing there, just staring back at me. I thought to myself, what a weird man. But maybe he's just drunk. I did think that it might just be a coincidence when we were moving to the same side of the road, trying not to bump into each other, as that does happen from time to time. But I wasn't even close to him when I first started moving to the right, so no matter how I looked at it, that whole encounter was just very odd. At this point, I started to walk faster as I got frightened. As I approached the crossroads, I naturally looked back, just to check if any car was coming before I crossed the road, and in the corner of my eye, I saw that same weird man who I'd bumped into earlier, and he was now walking up the road, following me. I was absolutely petrified. This meant that he had completely changed his direction, and he could only be walking for me. I instinctively ran across the road and walked as fast as I could, whilst grabbing my phone to call my brother in the hopes that he could come down and meet me. In my mind, I was still having thoughts that maybe I was just being too sensitive and I was overreacting. So I turned my head again, wanting to see if this is actually happening. But there he was, the same burgundy beanie and a brown jacket, with a Tesco shopping bag in his hand, walking in a fast pace, just around 2 meters away from me. After that, I was 100% sure that this was not a coincidence. "Hello? Are you on your way back yet?" I can hear my brother's voice through my phone, and I started explaining to him what was happening, with my voice trembling, whilst power walking up the road. I was so grateful he acted so quickly, and he came running down the road to meet me. As I saw my brother waving his hands and calling my name, I stopped and turned to see if the man was still following me. He was, but once he saw my brother, he did a quick turn to walk in the opposite road, and vanished into a dark alleyway. Once I was in the arms of my brother, I went into more detail about what had happened, and he instinctively ran after the man. But by this time, he had already completely disappeared. From that day on, my brother has always been so insistent that I inform him whenever I need to go anywhere, so he can check up on me. But I know I can't rely on him forever, so I can only hope that I never have to experience something so terrifying ever again. The next 3 stories are ones that I have already told on this channel, but again they were stories heavily based on my girlfriend's own experiences. I had recently moved over to the US from China for college, and I was working at my local McDonald's to earn some extra cash. It was the middle of winter, and I was working until 2 AM to cover a friend's shift. There was a weird old man who worked as a cleaner at the restaurant. He always spoke to me on my breaks and gave me inappropriate comments about my appearance. On this particular night, the old man was also on the late shift, cleaning the floors by the front doors. As I was walking out at the end of my shift, he tried to talk to me as usual, and as he was blocking the doors, I tried to be friendly and make conversation with him to avoid any awkwardness. He asked me where I was originally from, and I told him China. He then asked if I missed my family, and I said yes, but I would be seeing them soon, as I was planning to visit them for a few weeks. He then jokingly asked if he could come with me and promised that he would behave, saying this with a creepy smile on his face. I awkwardly laughed and tried to edge past him to go out the door, but he just continued to insist that I could in fact trust him, and that he had always wanted to visit China, so it would be perfect. I began to feel very uncomfortable, but I just laughed again, hoping that he would take the hint and let me go. However, he still continued to block the doors, and didn't seem to be taking my hints at all. I didn't know what else to do, so I just said goodnight and asked if I could squeeze by, but in response, he lifted his mop and was now purposely blocking the door. Sorry, I can't let you leave without a goodnight hug. It's a late shift tradition, and rules are rules. I froze in shock, as I really did not want to hug this man. I stood still for a few seconds before he suddenly leaned over to wrap his arms around me. As his fingers touched my waist, there was a sudden knock at the door that caught the cleaner off guard. He sheepishly let go of me and turned around. It was a customer asking if the McDonald's was still open. I instinctively squeezed past the cleaner and opened the door to greet the customer, and politely explained that we were closed. I used this opportunity to escape and stormed off towards my car. With my adrenaline running high, I unlocked the door and jumped inside as quickly as possible, fumbling to put my key in the ignition. But as my car started pulling away, I noticed the cleaner standing at the window, waving at me with that same creepy smile on his face. I put my foot down on the gas and raced out of that car park as fast as I could. After that night, I always refused to take the night shifts, but every now and then I would still bump into that cleaner. Luckily though, as it was always busy at the time, I was always able to avoid him. But nevertheless, it wasn't long before I quit that job and didn't look back. Shockingly, or maybe not so shockingly, a few months later I received a text from one of my ex-co-workers who told me that the cleaner was recently arrested in Thailand for stalking local women. He was consequently fired from his job at McDonald's due to his conviction, and it actually turned out that he had an unhealthy obsession with Asian girls. I was so creeped out when I heard the news. It made me realise just how lucky I was to have gotten away from him when I did. I shuddered at the thought of what could have happened if that customer hadn't knocked on the door that night. I remember I was on a school trip to France and we had to take a ferry to get there. I was excited as this was my first time on a ferry, and my friends and I were all chatting and taking pictures, just enjoying the ride. However, something strange caught my attention. There were a group of foreign men on the ferry, and they were taking pictures of some of the girls on our school trip. At first, it seemed harmless, as the girls were tolerating it and even posing for the camera. One of the men even put his arm around one of my female friends and posed with her. But as the ferry ride continued, things started to get even weirder. The men were taking more and more pictures, and they seemed to be getting closer to the girls. They started following them around the ferry, and it was clear that the girls were starting to feel uncomfortable. Then suddenly, we noticed that one of the girls had gone missing. We searched the entire ferry, but we couldn't find her anywhere. We were all worried sick, and the teachers were frantically calling her name over the intercom. Finally, we found her in an empty room, crying in the corner. She refused to talk and kept shaking her head when we asked her what happened. We didn't know what to do, and eventually there was nothing anybody could do, as she wasn't being honest about the situation. The ferry eventually docked in France, and we went on our school trip. But the incident on that ferry had haunted me for months afterwards. I knew something terrible had happened, and I knew the men taking pictures of the girls had something to do with it. It wasn't until a few months later that she finally opened up to me about what had really happened. She told me that one of the men had grabbed her and tried to force her into a room on the ferry. He apparently touched her inappropriately and tried to kiss her, but she had managed to break free and run away and hide. She was too scared to tell anyone at the time, as she was ashamed. I was furious when I heard this, and I demanded that she tell the police. But she was still too embarrassed and didn't want to make a big deal out of it, as it was her fault for tolerating them in the first place. Well, it took a lot of convincing, but eventually I was able to get her to come clean to the police about what had really happened on the ferry that day. The man was eventually caught and brought to justice, but my friend has never been the same since. She used to be so happy and would constantly be doing silly things to make us laugh, but now she's very reserved, and over time we've started seeing less and less of her. To be honest, I haven't spoken to her now for over a year, I think, but I truly hope that she is okay, and that she's been able to overcome that horrible experience. It was a Friday night, and my friends and I were having a blast at one of the most popular clubs in the city. As always, it was packed, the music was loud, and everyone was having a good time. I remember we'd been looking forward to this night for weeks, as it had been a while since we last saw each other, so we were determined to make the most of it. But as the night went on, the club got even more crowded. It soon became difficult to even move around. We were constantly being pushed and pulled by the crowds, and it felt like we were all packed in like sardines. The heat was intense, and the air was thick with sweat and alcohol, not to mention the countless men rubbing up against us accidentally, which was certainly making me uncomfortable, to say the least. There was one guy who actually grabbed my waist, and I instinctively pushed him off me and swore in his direction. I didn't get a look at his face before he abruptly pushed me back twice as hard, knocking me to the floor. It was chaotic, and people were instantly trampling all over me, unaware there was even a person by their feet. I was screaming for help, but the music was too loud, and no one seemed to hear me. I could feel the panic rising within me as I struggled to get up, but it was impossible with so many people around. As I laid there, I felt a surge of claustrophobia take over my body, and I started having what I'm told was a panic attack. I was completely helpless, and I had no idea how long it would be until someone noticed me. The noise and chaos of the club seemed to close in around me, and I truly felt like I was suffocating. I have absolutely no idea how long I was down there, but at some point everything went black, and that's the last thing I remember. Thankfully, one of my friends had noticed that I was missing and started searching for me. She eventually found me on the floor, unconscious and badly injured. She apparently started screaming for everyone to move out of the way, and a few strangers came over to help lift me up and carry me outside. Once we were outside, an ambulance was called and I was rushed to the hospital. When I finally woke up the next day, I was in so much pain, and I was still scared to death. I had never experienced anything like that before. At the hospital, the doctors told me that I had suffered several broken bones and had internal bleeding, which I'm still somewhat recovering from to this day. But to be honest, the emotional scars are even more severe. The fear that had gripped me during those moments on the floor still lingers, and every now and then, I find myself reliving the experience. This is a story about the worst flight of my entire life. So, it was supposed to be a routine flight, just like any other. I had boarded the plane and taken my seat, ready to settle in for the long journey ahead. But as I sat there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The man that was sitting next to me had struck me as odd. He was tall, thin, and had an unnerving smile that never seemed to leave his face. He didn't seem to blink much either, which only added to the unsettling feeling I got whenever I looked in his direction. I tried to ignore him, putting on my headphones and staring out the window as the plane took off. But as the flight progressed, things only got worse. The man started making strange noises like he was whispering to himself, and I could see from the corner of my eye that his gaze seemed to be fixated on me. Nevertheless, I decided to try and get some sleep, hoping that I could just ignore him until we landed. But when I woke up, I found him staring at me with that same creepy smile on his face. I was terrified, but with him being so close to me, I felt trapped. I tried to call for the flight attendant, but my voice caught in my throat. The man started shifting closer to me, and I could feel his breath on my skin. I was too scared to move, too scared to do anything. Then suddenly, the plane hit some turbulence, and it was like a jolt of electricity went through the cabin, and everything started shaking. The man was thrown back into his seat, and I took this opportunity to call over to the nearest flight attendant. I told her about the man and how he had been staring at me and making strange noises. She looked concerned, and the man quickly interrupted and was denying any wrongdoing. I tried to convince her that he was lying, and he knew exactly what I was talking about, but he just kept playing dumb. I pleaded with the flight attendant to let me move seats, but she just shook her head and apologized as there were no other seats on the flight. She asked the man to please be respectful of the other passengers and then walked off. We just sat in silence for a while after that. There were still 4 hours left of the flight, which made me feel claustrophobic. I tried to put it out of my mind and hoped that he wouldn't try anything again. But after about 30 minutes of silence, I could feel his breath on my neck again. I turned my head expecting the worst, but then I saw that his eyes were closed and his head was leaning to one side. At first I was relieved to see that he was asleep, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't quite out of the woods yet. I mean, we had over 3 hours left of this flight, and it was only a matter of time before he was awake again. I decided to start a crossword puzzle to pass the time, and this kept me busy for a little while, until I suddenly heard a deep voice and warm breath penetrating my eardrum. "Newspaper." I was in shock, and impulsively shouted, "What?" 14 across, 9 letters. It's newspaper." His mouth was still uncomfortably close to my ear, and I backed away. Can you move away from me, please?" He just stared at me again, but this time there was no smile. He looked angry, like he was about to hit me or something. "I was only trying to help, you moody bitch." At this point, the couple sitting behind me jumped in to my defence. "Oi, don't you call her that!" They then proceeded to shout for a flight attendant, who rushed over. This time the couple explained that this man had been harassing me all flight, and that he needed to be moved. Again, the flight attendant apologised and repeated the same line about how there were no other seats. But then, to my surprise, the guy sitting behind me offered to swap seats. The flight attendant agreed and asked for the man beside me to move out of his seat. He refused at first.
"Why do I have to move? If she wants to move, she can."
The flight attendant explained that he needed to move to let me out, but he continued to argue back. Eventually, a few of the other passengers had caught wind of the discussion, and they also came to my defence, demanding that he just move already. The atmosphere in the plane had turned sour, and you could feel the intensity rise, and then abruptly, the man jolted out of his seat and shouted at me to hurry up and move. He was given a warning by the flight attendant and told that if he says one more thing, he will be detained once the plane lands. He tried to talk back at first, but once he realised how serious she was, he eventually agreed to keep his mouth shut. I breathed a sigh of relief, grateful to be rid of him. But as the intensity of the situation started to fall, things suddenly got very real, very fast, as the plane started to shake and rattle, and a strange noise began erupting from the engine. Just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, the plane suddenly dropped. It felt like we were free-falling. People were screaming, and I genuinely felt like I was going to die. The air masks dropped down and the emergency lights came on, but after about 10 seconds of seriously believing that my life was about to end, the plane started levelling out, and the captain's voice came over the intercom. He apologised for the turbulence and told us that everything was going to be okay. We eventually landed safely, and I got off that plane as quickly as I could. I never saw that man again. But to be honest, I was just grateful to be alive. The final story was again one my girlfriend actually wrote herself, but I feel I must be honest, as that one is only loosely based in reality. Nevertheless, I wanted to include it anyway, as I think it's an interesting story, and again, it is technically based on her life. Either way, if you did enjoy the video, and you'd like me to narrate some more personal true horror stories like these, please let me know in the comments, and I will make sure to start working on them for a new video next week.